From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The U.S. takes the death penalty off the table for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the man who planned the September 11 attacks, in exchange for his guilty plea. Plus, listeners write in with questions and comments on President Biden's plan to restructure the U.S. Supreme Court. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Bill McGurn and Kim Strassel. In a letter dated July 31st from the Department of Defense Office of the Chief Prosecutor for Military Commissions and addressed to the families of September 11, 2001 victims, the prosecution said this: in exchange for the removal of the death penalty as a possible punishment, these three accused have agreed to plead guilty to all of the charged offenses, including the murder of the 2,976 people listed in the charge sheet, and to be later sentenced by a panel of military officers. They added later on in the letter, we recognize that the status of the case in general and this news in particular will understandably and appropriately elicit intense emotion. And we also realize that the decision to enter into a pretrial agreement will be met with mixed reactions among the thousands of family members who lost loved ones. But they add that this is their reasoned and good faith judgment that this resolution is the best path to finality and justice in this case. But what do you make of this and the details of this agreement and the decision to enter into it by the U.S.?
Well, for one thing, I do have to wonder if we wouldn't have learned about this deal until after the election had not Joe Biden stepped down from the presidency. That's just something on my mind. The deal was 27 months in the making, took a long time. I think the Biden administration has a point when it basically says, this is the best we can do under the circumstances. But the circumstances are really striking. Look, 20 years and KSM still hasn't been put to trial. And the reason was the Bush administration they set up military tribunals. And in 2008, KSM was ready to plead guilty and head on to execution as a martyr. And then the Obama administration came in and tried to move the terrorist cases to the New York federal courts, civilian courts, in other words. And so the credibility of the military courts was really savage for a while. All these law firms and experts came out. So you have a fundamental problem. You have terrorists that you cannot release, even now, because they're still dangerous. So you're never going to release them. And then you have, on the other hand, we don't seem to be able to have a trial for them because the rules of the trial on evidence, for example, could see us lose a case. In other words, it'd be easier to shoot a drone missile at KSM on streets of Egypt rather than sentence him to death over here. A lot of things have gone into that, but that's, I think, the fundamental problem because the rules of evidence, they're slightly better in military tribunals, but they still have the same problems. Basically, the terrorists reject all rules of warfare, yet they are benefiting from the ones extended to them.
Kim, what do you make of this deal? I think Bill makes some good points there, and to take off of one of them, the timing. It is an interesting moment for this to be announced. And Republicans, even if there is an argument that this deal is sort of ratifying the status quo, since it has been 20 years and this trial has not taken place, I think the Biden administration is opening themselves up to some pretty sustained criticism here. This is a statement from Republican Senate Leader Mitch McConnell. He says the plea deal with terrorists, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks that killed thousands of Americans, is a revolting abdication of the government's responsibility to defend America and provide justice. And then this is an interesting line. The only thing worse than negotiating with terrorists is negotiating with them after they are in custody. And Kim, I think you're going to be hearing a lot about this as an addition to the argument by Republicans that the Biden administration has not been a strong actor on the world stage in terms of deterring attacks and letting adversaries know that we mean business.
Revolting is not too strong of a word. And can I just add, our editorial and a lot of the news coverage has pointed out that There were 2,976 people listed on the charge sheet as having been executed by these terrorists in the 9/11 strikes. But that is not a number that really encompasses the mayhem and the horrific nature of how far this affected people. I mean, the parents who lost children, the children who lost parents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Even now, we still have 9/11 first responders who are dealing with health issues and dying from some of those health issues. So the catastrophe rolls on. And this is not, I think, what anyone would consider justice. So then you look at the political aspects of this. I think one thing really fascinating, the Biden White House is now coming out and saying, we didn't even know about this. We had no control over this. We only found out about this a couple of days ago. It wasn't our call. First of all, come on. I think that's a little hard to buy. But if it is true, why don't you? Why are you not involved in this? Why are you not keeping tabs on this? And why are not political actors within this White House engaging here and pushing back if this is something that you too in the White House did not agree with? They'd like to make it sound as though they had no role and it was beyond their control. That suggests that either they're ignorant or not being truthful. The timing here, some people are skeptical. There is a belief among some Republicans that Biden may have done this in order to take off the table the ability of Donald Trump to want a death penalty sentence, because there are a lot of human rights activists that have been pressuring this administration from the left to make sure that that didn't happen. It also has to be taken into the context of the President Biden's long-term vows that he's going to shut down Guantanamo Bay. This, in essence, should make that an easier prospect. That, again, is a political promise to his active left. And yes, I think it tees him up for a great deal of criticism, especially as one of the Trump campaign and Republican talking lines has been that this is a weak president who is not showing strength of America on the field and abroad. And I'm not quite sure how agreeing to a sentence where one of the most deadly terrorists has ever struck this nation in our history is now going to get a life sentence instead of the death penalty, how that sends a good message to other terrorists abroad.
Bill, do you have a sense of what a better path to justice would have looked like in this case? Because as you, I think, rightly point out, once the authorities pick up a suspect like this, a terrorist like this, it becomes almost a problem for them. And we're speaking in recent weeks, Israel has taken out leaders of Hezbollah and Hamas who organized terrorist attacks. But in the wake of 9/11, the U.S. really wanted the intel. And I think it's hard for some people who are maybe too young to remember to recall the real fear that there was another strike, maybe a big strike coming. And so there was a reason that the U.S. authorities wanted Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his accomplices to see what they might know about any other plans against the American homeland.
Yeah, war is an ugly business. And the basic problem, I think, is to try to rely on courts, whether military or civilian, to adjudicate our war, prosecute our war. Intelligence is a legitimate goal. We knew almost nothing about al-Qaeda's operations when they attacked. Or my impression from the Bush days is that he gave up a lot of good intelligence. That doesn't mean he shouldn't still be executed for his role. And I think the public is quite right to be outraged. And this idea, there were two ideas. One is, let's put in the courts, and Obama and Biden's idea was, let's put it in the civilian courts, which is the absolute worst place to prosecute this, as though it was ordinary criminal activity and not a war. That's one. But I think Kim will recall, during the time, the idea of the military courts were just savaged by everyone, as well as Guantanamo. It was, I think, in the liberal mind, Guantanamo was set up for this just so Dick Cheney could go there deep at night and shred the Constitution. There were legitimate concerns about security. Again, these people were never going to be released. And so I think what we got in the end is recognizing that, take the death penalty off the table, and hope that a military tribunal then finds him guilty. But I think the whole problem comes in with using the courts and rules of evidence that can be challenged. There are a million legal challenges by people that never accepted military courts and wanted to pretend we weren't in a war. And that's why we were at where we're at and why we're not where Israel's at, and they just get rid of the guys when they know. I mean, no one doubts that these guys are not guilty, right? They bragged about it. I think KSM bragged about personally decapitating our colleague Danny Pearl in Pakistan. I said something about doing it with his blessed left hand. So these are very bad people. If the death penalty comes in, it's certainly meant for them. But we find ourselves handicapped by the process we chose.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Let's turn to some letters from listeners on President Biden's proposal for Supreme Court term limits and a quote-unquote enforceable ethics code, which have generated a fair amount of interest from the Potomac Watch listenership. Vincent asks about what the controversy would look like if this term limits proposal passes. He says that is a separation of powers constitutional issue. So how does that issue case get to the Supreme Court for constitutional review and adjudication? He goes on to ponder who would have standing. Does the court have to sue? Who or what do they sue? Do they have to wait until there's a justice appointed under the term limits before they can sue? Would the court be a party to the suit? And would that require anybody to recuse? And Kim, I think these are some fascinating questions that I don't have great answers to. I mean, I can imagine a justice who is facing a term limit might have standing, or someone who works for that justice might have standing. But it also could be a clash, a constitutional clash outside of the courts. If the Congress passed some kind of bill for an enforceable ethics code that set up a panel to investigate, ethics complaints against the justices, and that panel asked for information from a justice, asked to interview a justice, and the justice refused, there you would have a constitutional clash where it's not really clear to me how that would be resolved. And the prospect of that kind of a face-off, and Vincent nods to this in his letter as well, is one of the reasons that this strikes me as such a bad idea.
Well, yeah, that is the takeaway. Because, by the way, I don't have the answers to this. And it's because we are once again going down the road of unprecedented. I keep saying, when you hear that word in Washington, you should be concerned. And it keeps getting used more and more. Look at what we've been going through recently. I mean, we've got a special counsel who for the first time is suing a former president. All the questions about classified documents, that case has now been dismissed. There's an appeals panel hearing whether or not it should be revived. All these questions about immunity. We've got that. We've had a number of questions in recent years as well, too, about what do you do when Congress passes a law and the executive branch changes it or doesn't implement it? Does Congress have the standing to sue? We've had some cases where it's been deemed that, yes, they do. What do you do when you have presidents like Joe Biden who are willy-nilly using executive power, for instance, to erase student debt? Who is standing to sue in those cases? And the reason these are so thorny is because they shouldn't really be happening. People, when they take the oath of office, ought to be following the rules. And that would include Democrats here who are arguing for a major constitutional change in uncharted territory and just inviting this kind of confusion about what the rules of the road are in such uncharted territories.
Frederick says he is frustrated by the timing of this discussion around Supreme Court ethics. He writes, for example, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has only recently passed away, and now 4 years later, they're ready to attack the court for things that she was as compromised on as her fellow justices. She'd also received exorbitant gifts and trips from friends and businesses. Justice Ginsburg, not her family members, had voiced her opinion to the press about Donald Trump as a presidential candidate. And Bill, I agree that this is a really striking double standard. As a reminder, she joked to the New York Times that if Trump won the election, she might consider moving to New Zealand. And to my eye, that is a much more direct statement about the justice's views than any sort of reading between the lines about what flags Justice Samuel Alito's wife flew at his beach house. And to be clear, justices are people too. They have their own opinions. And I don't think that joke about New Zealand suggested any sort of non-judicial bias in Justice Ginsburg's subsequent rulings on whatever happened in the Trump administration. But boy, Sheldon Whitehouse surely would not see it that way if things were on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, look, it points to the overriding fact of this proposal. It's the Supreme Court had reached the decisions that Joe Biden wanted it to reach. there would be no talk of its ethics and so forth. It only comes up because he disagrees with the court, and he would like to engineer it so that the court ends up agreeing with him. They'll get rid of the justices who disagree, or at least outnumber them, and put in the ones that disagree. I think people see the farce. You know, when you were outlining those aspects of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg facts and everything, I'm thinking we laugh at the medieval theologians that tried to count the number of angels on pinheads. And the kind of questions this raises are just the same. And I think they multiply with this. That's why it's so bad, the mischief. It really is a fundamental assault because, as Justice Scalia liked to point out, the separation of powers, Supreme Court running itself, its own branch of government, the separation of powers is much more the key to America's limited government than small government necessarily. It's the key to balancing power. And I think this would be a big chip away at that principle.